In Vilnius, the capital city of Lithuania, where I was born, lies the district of Lazdynai. Taking one look at it, you might say it seems like a pretty typical example of a Soviet-era residential district, but in the 70s, when its construction was finished, it was held up as the shining example of urban development in the entire Soviet Union. So much so that in 1974 it won the Lenin Prize, the most prestigious Soviet award that could be granted to achievements in culture, art, and science. And it was the first time this award was given to an urban residential district as a whole. Soviet officials presented Lazdynai as an ideal model of urban socialist living, and tourists from abroad were even given tours around it. So let's take a closer look and find out what set this district above the rest. In the post-war period, the Soviet Union had a massive housing shortage, and it was clear that drastic changes were needed in order to solve it. Under Stalin, the primary focus was on developing heavy industry, and housing was not a top priority. Most urban workers lived in communal apartments, dormitories, and barracks that tended to be severely overcrowded. The apartment blocks known as Stalinkas were relatively rare and prestigious, housing only a small portion of the urban population, mostly people like high-ranking party members, artists, scientists, writers, and the like. Stalin's preferred architecture was neoclassical and historicist, and included prominent representational elements. The idea was that such architecture was more appealing to the proletariat, but in addition to old building methods, decorations and ornamentations also extended the required construction time. To meet the needs of a rapidly growing urban population, a more efficient approach was needed. And so, in 1955, the Communist Party under Khrushchev adopted a resolution on the elimination of excesses in design and construction, which marked a shift from Stalin's favored neoclassicism to modernism, shunning unnecessary decorations and ornamentations and focusing mainly on functionalism, with the ultimate goal of providing every family in the Soviet Union with an apartment. Thus, the shift in aesthetics was prompted by economic reasons. Residential architecture was industrialized to be as cheap and efficient as possible, and this was done by standardizing apartment blocks with the use of prefabricated elements. Factories would mass-produce concrete panels that could then be shipped to any location and assembled like Lego blocks, sometimes in a matter of weeks. Buildings were to be constructed almost in the way that cars were constructed in one of Ford's factories. Everything from the walls to the doors and windows were standardized and mass-produced, making it possible to house people at a rate and scale that was unseen in history, constructing about 2 million apartments a year. In 1961, the Third Congress of Soviet Architects boasted of the enormous productivity of Soviet housing, but they also criticized the, quote, lack of creativity in the use of standard designs. Soviet housing, and really government housing in general, does have a reputation of being monotonous, and residents were already complaining about monotony back then. Residential areas were being standardized to the point of losing any kind of local identity, replacing local landscapes with straight, repetitive rows of prefabricated blocks. One of the central characteristics of Soviet architecture was the distinction between standard and experimental buildings, where standard ones were mass-produced and experimental ones were specially designed for a given location. Many architects themselves were not very enthusiastic when overseeing the construction of residential districts, as it was often a merely technical matter without any chance for creativity, the simple laying out of predetermined elements. Instead, architects would hope to be assigned an experimental project. Recognizing complaints about urban monotony, in 1963 the Communist Party implemented a decree on improvement of design practice in the field of civil construction, planning, and construction of cities, which intended to fight the problem by transferring more responsibility to regional and local levels, thus giving local architects and developers more freedom in modifying the standard buildings and experimenting with design and planning, making it possible for architects to exercise creativity even with residential projects. Further continuing the battle against urban monotony, another decree was accepted under Brezhnev in 1969 on measures to improve the quality of residential and civil construction, which, in addition to calling for improved construction quality and greater comfort, encouraged more expressivity in architecture, unique cityscapes, and residential areas with a stronger sense of local identity. And that is exactly what Lazdynai, which was then in the process of being constructed, was meant to do. In post-war Lithuania, planners made the wonderful decision to preserve the historical Vilnius town center as much as they could. During World War II, battles between Nazi and Soviet soldiers damaged a lot of the city's historical buildings, and initially, some such buildings were simply replaced with new neoclassical ones. But when it was time to plan the newest modernist districts, planners decided that such buildings would destroy the aesthetic consistency of the old town center. Therefore, the Nedis River was used as a natural boundary, separating the historical downtown from the newly planned residential districts, preserving the old town's historical layout and skyline, while at the same time building roads and bridges across the river and connecting the old town center with the new residential districts via public transport routes, thus avoiding a conflict between modern residential efficiency and historical preservation. It's no secret that the scale and rapid pace of construction often led to poor construction quality, but post-war Soviet developers had three major advantages: generous state funding, along with the faith in long-term planning, and perhaps most importantly, publicly owned land, which meant that every part of a district could be developed as part of a total plan, without interference from private property. This allowed Soviet planners to develop a new type of district, which would be made up of so-called mikrorayons, or microdistricts, the basic neighborhood unit. These are made up of apartment block groupings containing about 2,000 residents. Several of these make up the microdistrict of about 6,000 to 10,000 residents, and several microdistricts make up the residential district, which tended to house 25,000 to 50,000 residents. The districts were to be separated from industry by greenery to avoid the noise and smoke produced by factories. And so, because most workers would leave the district during the day to go to work, such districts got the nickname of sleeping districts. This was the standard model for post-war Soviet residential districts, including Lazdynai. At the center of this model were the principles of walkability and accessibility, where every single microdistrict had at least one school and kindergarten and shops that covered your basic daily needs. None of these elements of urban design were unique to the Soviet Union as such. In fact, they were part of the global phenomenon of modernist planning. The industrial panel-based construction method was actually bought from France, where it had been patented by Raymond Camus and used to rebuild war-torn districts. The Microdistrict Model drew from the concept of the neighborhood unit, a model of self-contained and functional neighborhoods developed by American Clarence Perry. And most Western countries in the post-war period had large social housing programs, like the Swedish Million Program, which built 1 million apartments between the mid-60s and early 70s. All of these influenced the Soviet approach, but it was only in the Soviet Union that this approach was realized on such a massive scale and utilized for such a long time, all the way until the USSR's dissolution in 1991. This district model came with a 3-tier model of public services, organized according to how often a given service tends to be utilized. In the first tier, you have services people use daily, like schools, kindergartens, and basic shops, and every microdistrict needed to have these, such that they would be only about 150 meters away from a given housing block, and could be walked to in mere minutes. In the second tier, you have services used a couple times a week, like libraries, cinemas, department stores, healthcare facilities. These would service several microdistricts, intended to be about 500 meters away from a given housing block, so still extremely accessible by foot. And finally, the third tier, covering services used a couple times a month, like an opera house or a leisure center, and this would serve as the entire residential district and the wider city. This model was incredibly convenient for pedestrians, as, apart from work, all your daily and weekly needs were within walking distance. It was great for children, who were able to walk to school in minutes without having to cross any busy roads, and the playgrounds found in every microdistrict were safe to play in because of their distance from the roads. The pedestrian-friendly approach was partly a matter of necessity, given the low rate of car ownership in the Soviet Union at the time. But when you've lived in a car-centric American city, it sounds like a luxury. We can see these principles realized in the case of Lazdynai. It is made up of 4 microdistricts. You see the highway connecting the district to other parts of the city for cars and public transport, but it is in between microdistricts, such that you don't have to cross it to walk to a store or school. Each microdistrict is also linked with a single circular intersection. The purple buildings are schools, the red ones are kindergartens. As you can see, every microdistrict has at least one of each, and the green buildings are shopping centers. Now, this all sounds good to me, but the 3-tier microdistrict model was by no means unique to Lazdynai, and so it doesn't explain why it was Lazdynai in particular that won the Lenin Prize. Well, during the period known as the Khrushchev thaw, the Soviet Union allowed for a greater amount of Western influence in art and culture, and trips for specialists were organized to visit the newest social housing districts in non-Soviet Europe, like Sweden and France. The 2 talented Lithuanian architects who were assigned the Lazdynai project, Vytautas Brėdikis and Vytautas Čekanauskas, went to Finland, one of the most common countries to visit outside the Eastern Bloc, where they acquainted themselves with the architecture of Alvar Aalto, not to be confused with Arvo Aalto, who was later head of the Finnish Communist Party. They went to the district of Tapiola, whose designers had tried to reconcile modernist residential architecture with its natural surroundings, and this approach left a lasting impression on the Lithuanians. Brėdikis is describing it as good, humane architecture, a masterful harmony of buildings and nature, and they brought this approach right back home. See, Lazdynai was a naturally hilly and forested area, and in previous residential projects, such features tended to be destroyed, leveling and flattening the area to make the placement of blocks as easy as possible. For example, the first large-scale housing district in Riga, Latvia, against Kalna Priedes, was developed in an area with several high dunes and clusters of pine trees, but these were removed to make place for the buildings. Inspired by the Finnish architects, the architects of Lazdynai were determined to collaborate with nature instead of negating it. They tried to make the layout of the buildings appear as almost organically emerging from the topology of the landscape, and even the roads were partly based on natural pre-existing paths in the ground. The apartment blocks were constructed among groups of trees, with an untouched forest area complementing the district as well. Inspired by Lithuania's villages, they wanted to provide residents with plenty of greenery. The forest ended up being a popular place of leisure, where families would go to relax in the weekends, and people would go hiking, hunting for mushrooms and berries, and even skiing in the winter. The greenery would end up being one of the most commonly cited reasons for the residents' fondness for the district. The most technically demanding attempt to collaborate with the natural landscape was the decision to build apartment blocks along descending slopes, one variation having the apartment blocks increase in number of floors as the slope descends, and another variation having the roofs follow the descension of the slope. This was the first time this was done in the entire Soviet Union, and was made possible thanks to tight-knit collaboration between the architects, engineers, and construction workers of Vilnius. Such collaboration allowed for several other modifications, leading Lazdynai to have a total of 15 different apartment building types, and while the differences between them are subtle, it was the first time a post-war Soviet district had this level of variety. They also produced apartment blocks that were bent, rather than placed in a straight line, with the intention of making the placement look more organic. The standard apartments were given some subtle modifications as well, like a slightly bigger kitchen or a balcony that recedes into the building instead of protruding. The most common apartment type had 2 rooms, with 3-room apartments not far behind. And they were not very big, but the architects made up for it with large and well-designed pedestrian areas, and there was a considerably greater distance between apartment blocks than required by regulations, making the district feel more spacious. One of the principles behind Soviet urban design was to have private space cover the necessities, but encourage people to spend more time in public areas in common with others. In Lazdynai, pedestrians were well provided for, with wide walkways complete with benches, lampposts, and landscaping, with flower beds and rock gardens that were also planned out and well looked after, adding some color to the district. The architects were highly aware that what makes a good apartment is not just what's inside it, but the context that surrounds it. This area, for instance, would have been wide enough for a road or additional buildings, but the architects saved it for a pedestrian alley, and the American mind cannot comprehend this. Lazdynai was the subject of one of Lithuania's earliest cases of urban sociology, where a survey was given to residents, and its results were seen as confirmation of the district's worth, as 91.6% of participants said that they wouldn't leave their Lazdynai apartment even if they could trade it for any other location in the city. The most common complaints, on the other hand, concerned subpar floor quality, which was noted by 1/4 of the participants, and to a lesser extent poor sound insulation. In addition to the standard 5-floor, 9-floor, and 12-floor apartment buildings, 2 types of experimental 16-floor towers were built in the 1980s, designed specifically for Lazdynai using recent developments in the use of monolithic concrete. Their placement had already been planned in the original Lazdynai project to have them serve as vertical accents, visible on the horizon when you're approaching the district from the west. These completed the district skyline with what is my personal favorite building type in the district. I'd also like to point out the circular garages, because I haven't seen anyone else talk about them. It's the only place that I have seen garages like this, and while garages can often be eyesores that intrude upon the cityscape, I think these are quite neat and add to the district's uniqueness. In determining the layout of the apartment blocks, the architects took account not only of the aesthetic appearance of the district's silhouette and the pedestrian experience, they also considered the views that residents within the building would see through their window, so that instead of seeing just the neighboring building's wall, they would see the greenery outside, and parents could watch over their children in the local playground or while they walked to school. While the schools and kindergartens were also largely made of prefabricated parts, opportunities for creativity were found here as well. Most notably, a middle school in which architect Czeslavas Mazuras used prefabricated elements in novel ways to produce an original terraced building, also incorporating the natural sloping terrain and using red brick along with the concrete panels for greater variety. It was common in Soviet district planning for microdistricts to have a microdistrict center, housing a variety of stores and services. Lazdynai had 3 such centers, which were also made up of standard elements but in some cases modified. The most famous of these was Erfurtas, named after the German town of Erfurt, a sister city to Vilnius, which at the time was part of East Germany. The Erfurtas complex included grocery stores, a pharmacy, a post office, a hair salon, a library, and other services, but the most famous part was the fancy Erfurtas restaurant and bar, which served as one of the very first nightclubs in all of Lithuania, and hosted various shows and concerts by musicians from all over the Eastern Bloc. If you were freaky, you could even catch the closest thing you had to Soviet striptease. The district also, of course, had a cinema, which was seen as an absolute necessity in any good Soviet district, and an indoor swimming pool, where Olympic-level athletes would train. To further distinguish the district, unique sculptures were built throughout it. 2 of them had Lithuanian folk motifs. Near the Erfurtas center, you had the Vėtrungė, which is a traditional Lithuanian type of weather vane showing you the direction of the wind. Around it is a decorative pool, which today, sadly, is dry. Then there is the kanklinike, a statue of a woman playing the kankles, a stringed Lithuanian folk instrument. A sculpture named Morning, but colloquially referred to more often simply as the horse, has become one of the symbols of Lazdynai. And my favorite is the somewhat sexy construction worker, looking up at the sky on his knees, mogging you with his abs and chiseled jawline, dedicated to the construction workers who toiled to make Lazdynai possible. These sculptures simultaneously function as landmarks that help people orient themselves in the district, and as aesthetic works that add to the district's sense of local identity. For its clever layout, variety, and completeness, the district was awarded the Lenin Prize in 1974, and was the subject of a ton of publicity both at home and abroad. Guided tours were given around Lazdynai, presenting it as an exemplar of modern socialist urbanism, and important visitors would dine at the Erfurtas restaurant. At this time, there were 3 ways you could get an apartment in Soviet Lithuania. The fastest, but also most expensive way was to join a housing cooperative, where apartments were built privately instead of state-funded. Secondly, you could join a queue and wait for the state to allocate you an apartment, but this was notorious for its waiting times, as it could take more than a decade before you got one. Therefore, people used the third method, which allowed you to speed up the waiting time thanks to ties to local organizations. Your workplace, your trade union, your local party organization, these could help you acquire an apartment faster. Once you got a state apartment, you did have to pay monthly rent, but the rent was highly subsidized to the point of being more like a symbolic fee and could be covered by less than 5% of your average monthly wage. Now, to get allocated an apartment in a coveted district like Lazdynai, you did have to be lucky, but you didn't necessarily have to be powerful or famous. One of the principles behind such allocation was the urban integration of different social groups, such that a factory worker could live in the same district and same apartment type as, say, a university professor. Some of the first residents of Lazdynai were some of the very construction workers who built it, as well as Lithuania's most famous photographer, Antanas Sutkus, who photographed the district and its residents. Despite such integration, residents did tend to stick with neighbors of a similar social background, and the sociological study showed that people with the higher education tended to socialize with neighbors less in general than those with a lower education. However, the mixed social makeup of the district prevented the problem that plagued so much Western social housing, where government-built districts would quickly deteriorate into ghettos for the poor and become instruments of class segregation. Take as an example the Marais district in Toulouse, France, one of the very districts that inspired the architects of Lazdynai. This district, which was looked up to as an example of the West's advanced urbanism, quickly became underfunded, deteriorating in value, with most of the middle-class residents moving out, thus becoming a ghetto for low-income families and migrants, with a 40% unemployment rate and a crime problem. In comparison, Lazdynai retained a relatively average social makeup even decades after privatization. In fact, at least according to data from 2001 to 2011, Soviet-type residential districts in Lithuania remained less socially and ethnically segregated than other parts of the city. Jurgis Vanagas, the author of the sociological study on Lazdynai, recalled how one time a delegation of planners from West Germany came to visit the district and said that it was nice, but that such a residential district could only be built when land is owned publicly. On private land, this would be impossible. Lithuania broke away from the Soviet Union in 1990, and while Lithuanian architects welcomed independence, some regretted the mass privatization that came along with it, as it meant the end of large-scale ambitious public projects like that of Lazdynai. Professor of Art and Architectural History John Maciuika said, "There was a bit of a fork in the road after independence. Initially, it was perceived by the architecture community as a bit of a tragedy. It became possible in independent Lithuania to own private property and to build houses through private contractors. Immediately, you had all these McMansions everywhere, springing out of the ground like mushrooms, oversized monstrosities that represented the nouveau riche. That's where architects tried to step in as educators of taste and say, look, it's not all about how much square footage you have, and it's not all about having a triple-height entrance hall with a staircase. It's also about making your building fit the site, and how it interacts with the movement of the sun over the site, how air and light come into the building, as well as to facilitate healthy living and have the buildings fit together into a community of buildings. With the loss of publicly owned land and large state-funded architectural projects, there also in many cases came a loss of architectural coherence and consistency. In a late interview, Vytautas Brėdikis, one of Lazdynai's architects, criticized the new glass buildings of Vilnius's new commercial district, calling them awful for lacking harmony, making an analogy between social atomization and architectural incoherence. Buildings, like people, need to get along, and he saw these buildings as appearing inconsiderate of their surroundings, even hostile to one another, and that's why he's the GOAT. Lazdynai is officially listed as cultural heritage, but the consequences of that are not clearly defined or enforced, and new buildings continue being built without necessarily taking account of the district's general aesthetic character. It's one thing to preserve a single building, but how do you preserve an entire district as a work of art, especially when it is being transformed by vast social changes? It's inevitable for a residential district to change, but how should such changes be regulated? From small changes, like private residents replacing their wooden window frames with plastic ones, to large changes in the district's very skyline. At which point do we consider the cultural heritage to have been damaged? Since the 90s, changes to such residential districts have been driven by two main factors: increased car usage and an increased need for commercial spaces. With increased car usage, pedestrian areas come to be utilized less, and more parking space is required. Hence, some former pedestrian spaces in Lazdynai are now parking lots, and commercial buildings are often built without much consideration for the surrounding context, thus potentially threatening the district's architectural consistency. Some residents worry about new buildings making the district crowded and less spacious, as it was intended to be, which could also interfere with the district's intended layout and silhouette. This raises questions about what our duty is to districts when understood as cultural heritage. While many of Lazdynai's longtime residents are fond of the district, some Lithuanians view Lazdynai and similar districts highly negatively, as repulsive or outdated symbols of the Soviet era, foreign impositions rather than a part of Lithuanian heritage. But I think this is a mistake. After all, the district was designed by Lithuanian architects who were inspired by Vilnius's historical town center and natural landscape, and took influence from a variety of recent developments, not just in the Eastern Bloc, but the rest of Europe. I also find it hypocritical that the people who want to demolish Soviet architecture for political reasons don't seem to speak that way of Tsarist architecture. In existing social conditions, another Lazdynai is as unlikely to be built as another old town. And just as Lithuania's post-war planners decided to treat the old Vilnius town center as a valuable integral whole and preserved it as such, so should we treat Lazdynai, as heritage to be preserved in its aesthetic consistency. The value of architectural heritage increases with the passage of time, and if we preserve Lazdynai, I believe that people in the future will feel that same kind of gratitude about such preservation efforts as we do about the preservation of the Old Town or the Vilnius Cathedral. Before we end, I'd like to show you some film photography that I took in Lazdynai myself. Finally, I'd like to thank my patrons, to whom I would allocate apartments in Lazdynai if it were up to me. 404 Error, Just Undo It, Andre Oliva, Andy Pandy, Ben E, Blue Blue Blue, Celsius Enjoyer, Daniel Swing, Davy Jones 99, Evie Rosk, Eric Owens, Felon Mask, Francois Yuewu, Harbin Moths, Hong Kong Aesthetics, Ian Fowler, John D. Pagani, Joshua Anthemic Lullaby, Katy Perry is John Benet Ramsey, Kelly Huiskamp, M. Lim, Marius Labontu, Matthew Dominic, Matthew James, Max Bendick, Nathaniel Lark, Nathaniel Owen, Abominards, Paul Windfer, PDXJ Morris, Post Elvis, Procyon, Prophet Overlord, Rachel Ann, Radical Q, Ryan Kenny, Sky, Socialism with Post-Rock Characteristics, Stax Murner, Sure Shot, Temporarily Embarrassed Delusionaire, The Joker from 2016, Tor Larson, Victor Redko, Wentao Suyi, Yesterday's Rise, as well as all of these wonderful patrons. I appreciate you watching the whole video. If you support me on Patreon, you will gain access to some additional materials and photos of Lazdynai, and feel free to ask me if there's something else you'd like to know about the district. You'll also be able to vote on occasional polls in deciding the next video topic, which is how this topic was chosen. I know this subject is quite far from my more philosophical or political videos, but I hope you found it interesting nonetheless. Let me know if you'd like more videos on similar topics. Have a good one. Thank you.